My lovely YouTube family, thank you so much for being here. Your support means everything to me, and I truly believe I am nothing without all of you. If you're ready to dive into this unforgettable journey, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss a single moment. Together we'll walk through every twist and turn, uncovering the truth behind Sophie's story. You don't want to miss what's coming next. Leave a comment and let me know your thoughts. What do you think will happen next? I can't wait to hear from you. Now, sit back, relax, and enjoy the ride. This story is just getting started. Sometimes, a single night can change your life forever. But what if that night held secrets you never saw coming? What if a chance encounter with a stranger turned into something far more than you ever imagined? Meet Sophie Carter, a woman whose world was shattered until one unexpected moment altered everything. She thought it was just a fleeting memory, a mistake even. But little did she know, fate had bigger plans. Who is the mysterious man who changed her life? What happens when two completely different worlds collide? And can love truly conquer everything, even the darkest secrets? Join me as we uncover a love story full of twists, emotions, and choices that could break hearts and change destinies. The neon lights flickered outside as Sophie Carter pushed open the heavy doors of the Velvet Rose, an upscale bar nestled in the heart of New York City. She wasn't the kind of woman who drowned her sorrows in alcohol, but tonight was different. Tonight her heart felt shattered beyond repair. Her hands trembled slightly as she took a seat at the bar, the weight of the past week pressing down on her chest. Losing her job had been devastating, but walking in on her boyfriend, her so-called forever love, with another woman had been the final blow. She exhaled sharply, blinking back the sting of fresh betrayal as she signaled the bartender. "Whiskey neat. You look like you need something stronger than that," a deep, smooth voice murmured beside her. Sophie turned, her breath catching in her throat. He was breathtaking. Tall, impeccably dressed in a tailored black suit, the man exuded an air of effortless power. But it wasn't just his clothes that screamed wealth, it was the way he carried himself. His piercing blue eyes locked onto hers with an intensity that sent a shiver down her spine. His dark, slightly tousled hair framed a strong, chiseled jaw, and when he smirked, a dimple appeared just above his lip, dangerously tempting. She should have looked away, but she didn't. Instead, she found herself leaning in, her fingers tightening around her glass. "And what exactly do I look like I need?" The man chuckled, low and husky, and the sound sent an unexpected thrill through her body. A distraction. His words were like a challenge. Sophie tilted her head, amusement flickering through the haze of sadness clouding her mind. A distraction. That was exactly what she needed. They talked, and the world around them faded. She learned that he was charming, intelligent, and incredibly easy to talk to. He had a confidence about him, not arrogant but assured. He listened when she spoke, his gaze never wavering, as if every word she said was worth more than gold. And for the first time in forever, Sophie felt seen. One drink turned into two turned into three, and with each sip, her broken heart seemed to ache a little less. She wasn't sure who moved first, but suddenly his hand was brushing against hers, his fingertips barely skimming her skin. A spark ignited. She glanced up, meeting his smoldering gaze. The air between them was charged, electric. And then, as if the universe had planned it, the power in the bar flickered for just a moment, casting them in dim candlelight. The moment felt surreal, like something out of a dream. He leaned in closer, his breath warm against her ear. "Let's get out of here." Sophie knew this was reckless, knew she shouldn't follow a stranger into the night. But tonight she didn't care. Tonight she wanted to forget. She let him take her hand. The hotel room was bathed in soft golden light, the city skyline stretching endlessly beyond the massive windows. It was elegant, expensive, just like him. The door clicked shut behind them, the silence thick with anticipation. Sophie's heart pounded as she turned to face him. For a moment, neither of them spoke. There was no need for words. He reached for her first, his strong hands cupping her face as he pressed his lips to hers in a kiss so deep, so consuming, it stole the very breath from her lungs. Sophie melted into him, her hands sliding up his chest, feeling the firm muscles beneath his dress shirt. His kiss was intoxicating, a slow burning fire that spread through her veins. His hands roamed her back, pulling her flush against him. Every touch sent shivers down her spine. She gasped as he trailed kisses down her neck, his lips igniting a fire wherever they touched. Her fingers tangled in his hair, pulling him closer, needing more. Their movements were desperate, fueled by longing and something deeper, something unspoken. Clothes fell to the floor, forgotten. Skin met skin. And in the dim glow of the city lights, they became lost in each other. It wasn't just passion. It was something more. A connection neither of them could explain. For Sophie, it was a night of escape. A night where she didn't have to think about heartbreak or betrayal. For him, it was a night he knew he wouldn't forget. The next morning, Sophie woke up to an empty bed. The sheets beside her were cold. The air still carried the faint scent of his cologne, but he was gone. No note, no number, no name. Just a memory of a stranger's embrace. She closed her eyes, exhaling a shaky breath. It was supposed to be just one night. No names, no expectations. But fate had other plans. The rain pattered softly against the window as Sophie Carter sat on the edge of her tiny bed, her hands trembling around the small white plastic stick she held. 2 pink lines. Her heart slammed against her ribs, her breath caught somewhere between a sob and a scream. Pregnant. No! 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 Her voice was barely above a whisper, but the weight of the word crashed into her like a tidal wave. She blinked rapidly, as if willing the test to change, as if somehow the universe had made a mistake. But no matter how hard she wished, the result stayed the same, undeniable, irreversible. Tears welled up in her eyes as she set the test down on her nightstand, her mind spinning wildly. This wasn't supposed to happen. She pressed her fingers against her temples, trying to steady herself. How had her life unraveled so quickly? Just weeks ago she had a stable job, a boyfriend she had foolishly believed loved her, and a plan for the future. And now, her job was gone, her heart was broken, and she was carrying the child of a man she knew nothing about. A stranger with piercing blue eyes, a touch that had sent fire through her veins, and a voice that had made her body tremble with need. She squeezed her eyes shut, trying to push away the memory of that night. The way he had held her, the way he had kissed her, as if she were the only woman in the world. Sophie let out a shaky breath and wrapped her arms around her stomach. There was life inside her now, a tiny heartbeat, a tiny soul. And she had no idea how to find the father. She paced the small space of her apartment, her mind running in frantic circles. "This can't be real," she whispered to herself, her hands gripping her hair. It was just one night, just one damn night. She tried to remember every little detail about him, but she had been too caught up in the intoxicating pull of his presence to ask the important things. His last name, where he worked, his damn phone number. All she had was the memory of a hotel room bathed in golden light, the way his lips had traced her skin, the way he had whispered in her ear as if she belonged to him, even if just for that moment. And now she was carrying his child. She pulled her knees up to her chest and let the first tear fall. She had always thought she'd have a family one day, a husband who loved her, a baby born out of a planned future, a stable home where love could grow. But this was terrifying. And worse, she was completely, utterly alone. A thought struck her, making her sit up straight. The bar. That was where she had met him. If she could just go back and ask around, maybe, just maybe, someone would know who he was. She wiped her tears away and grabbed her coat. She had to try. She owed it to her baby. The neon glow of the velvet rose flickered against the darkened city skyline as Sophie Carter hesitated at the entrance. The last time she had stepped through these doors, her life had been completely different. Before the two pink lines, before the fear, before the desperate need to find a man she knew almost nothing about. Now, she stood here again, her heart hammering in her chest, hoping, praying, that someone knew him. She pushed open the heavy doors, stepping into the familiar dimly lit bar. The air was thick with the scent of whiskey, cigars, and expensive cologne. Laughter and conversation hummed all around her, but all she could hear was the pounding of her own pulse. Her gaze swept across the room, scanning for him. Tall, dark hair, piercing blue eyes, a presence that made the air crackle. But he wasn't there. Her fingers clenched around the strap of her purse as she made her way toward the bar, her mind racing with what she would say. What if no one knew him? What if he had just been passing through? She couldn't let herself think that way. She had to try. The bartender, a tall man with salt and pepper hair, leaned over as she approached. "What can I get you, sweetheart?" Sophie swallowed hard. "Actually, I was wondering if you remember a man who was here a few weeks ago. Tall, dark hair, blue eyes, expensive suit. He was sitting right over there." She gestured toward the booth where it had all begun. The bartender frowned, his eyes narrowing slightly in thought. "That describes half the men that come in here." She exhaled sharply, her heart sinking. No, I can't let this be a dead end." "He was different," she insisted, "commanding, confident, like he owned the room." The bartender shook his head slowly. "Sorry, sweetheart, I don't recall." Desperation clawed at her throat as she turned to a waitress carrying a tray of martinis. "Excuse me," she said, her voice pleading. "Do you remember a man from a few weeks ago? Dark hair, blue eyes. He was sitting in that booth with me." The waitress glanced over, then back at Sophie with an apologetic smile. "Sorry, hun. We see so many faces, it's hard to remember just one." Sophie's stomach dropped. It was like he never existed. She stumbled away from the bar, pressing a hand to her stomach as the reality set in. He was gone. A ghost. A fleeting moment in her past. She had nothing, no name, no contact, no way to find him. And now she was carrying his child. Tears burned at the back of her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. Crying wouldn't fix this. She walked out of the bar, the night air cool against her heated skin. The city felt bigger than ever, overwhelming and suffocating, all at once. As she stood on the sidewalk, staring at the blurred lights of passing cars, a terrifying thought gripped her. Was she truly alone in this? She had imagined finding him, seeing the shock in his eyes when she told him about the baby. Maybe he'd want to be part of their lives. Maybe he'd care. But now, she had to accept that he might never know, that she might have to raise this child on her own. Her hand drifted to her stomach, her breath shaking as she whispered, "It's just us now, little one." And as terrifying as that was, she refused to let fear win. Sophie sat on her worn-out couch, staring at the pile of unpaid bills stacked on her tiny coffee table. Her bank account was nearly empty, her rent was due in 2 weeks, and now she had a baby to think about. The weight of her reality pressed against her chest, making it hard to breathe. She needed a job. Fast. She had applied everywhere she could think of, restaurants, boutiques, even receptionist positions, but every rejection email felt like another nail in her coffin. It was like the universe was against her. Then, just as she was about to give up, an email notification pinged on her phone. She opened it with shaking fingers, her heart hammering. Subject: Job opportunity at Knight Enterprises. Dear Miss Carter, we reviewed your resume and would like to offer you an interview for the executive assistant position at Knight Enterprises. Please confirm your availability for a meeting this week. Best regards, HR Department, Knight Enterprises. Sophie blinked at the screen, her breath catching. Knight Enterprises. It was one of the most powerful and prestigious corporations in the country, a multi-billion-dollar empire. Her hands trembled as she read the email again, convinced she must have misread it. She had applied to so many places out of desperation that she barely remembered sending an application to them. Why would a company like Knight Enterprises be interested in her? She had experience as a personal assistant, sure, but for small businesses, not global corporations. Still, this was her chance. A fresh start, a stable job, a way to provide for her baby. Without hesitation, she hit reply. Greater than dear HR team, greater than thank you for the opportunity. I am available for an interview this week. Looking forward to meeting you. Best regards. Sophie Carter. She pressed send and prayed. 3 days later, Sophie found herself standing outside the towering glass skyscraper that housed Knight Enterprises. The building loomed over the city, a symbol of power, wealth, and ruthless ambition. She inhaled deeply, smoothing her navy blue blazer over her slightly rounded stomach. She was barely 10 weeks along, and though she wasn't showing much, she still placed a protective hand over her belly before stepping inside. The lobby was breathtaking: marble floors, towering glass windows, and an air of quiet luxury that made her feel small and insignificant. As she approached the reception desk, a sharply dressed woman looked up and gave her a polite but distant nod. Name? Sophie Carter. I have an interview with... She glanced at the email again. Mr. Knight's executive team. The receptionist checked her system, then gestured toward the elevators. 25th floor. They're expecting you. Sophie's stomach twisted with nerves as she stepped into the elevator. This was her one shot. She had no idea what to expect, but she needed this job more than anything. The doors slid open with a soft chime, revealing an ultra-modern office space. Everything was sleek, grey, and expensive. She was led to a massive conference room, her heartbeat picking up speed as she waited. The door finally opened, and she froze. Because standing in front of her, looking impossibly powerful in a tailored suit, was him. The man from that night. The stranger she'd spent the night with. The father of her baby. Sophie's breath caught in her throat, her entire world tilting on its axis. Because now he wasn't just a stranger, he was Alexander Knight, the billionaire CEO of Knight Enterprises. And he was staring at her with the same piercing blue eyes that haunted her every thought. Sophie took a deep breath as she stepped off the elevator onto the top floor of Knight Enterprises. The air smelled of rich leather and expensive cologne, the entire space exuding an aura of power and precision. Today was her first day as an executive assistant, and she needed this job more than anything. For herself. For her baby. But nothing could have prepared her for what happened next. The moment she stepped into the CEO's office, her breath vanished, because there he was, the mystery man from that unforgettable night. The man who had touched her like she was the only woman in the world, the man whose baby she was now carrying. Nathaniel Knight, billionaire, business tycoon, ruthless, powerful, and completely unaware of the life they had created together. Sophie's heart pounded so loudly she could barely hear as she stood frozen in the doorway. Nathaniel sat behind his massive mahogany desk, flipping through a file, oblivious to the way her world was crashing down around her. He was just as devastatingly handsome as she remembered, if not more. Dark hair, piercing blue eyes, broad shoulders that strained against his tailored suit. His presence was overwhelming, the sheer authority he exuded making it impossible to breathe. This wasn't just some random stranger. This was the most powerful man in the city, and he was her boss. Her fingers clenched around the folder she held as she willed herself to remain calm, to pretend like her knees weren't trembling beneath her pencil skirt. This can't be happening. Not here. Not now. She had spent weeks searching for him, desperate to find the man who had unknowingly fathered her child, and now fate had thrown him right in front of her. But not in the way she had imagined. She had no plan for this. None. Nathaniel finally looked up, and the moment his icy blue gaze met hers, her entire body ignited. His eyes darkened slightly, as if trying to place her, his sharp brows furrowed just the slightest bit, his head tilting in thought. Sophie's breath hitched. Did he recognize her? The air grew thick with tension, the room shrinking around them. Then he spoke. "Miss Carter?" His deep voice sent a shiver down her spine. She swallowed hard and nodded. "Yes, sir." Nathaniel's eyes lingered on her for a moment longer than necessary, scanning her face with an intensity that made her stomach tighten. But then, just as quickly as it came, his expression shut down. Cool, unreadable, controlled. He didn't recognize her. Oh my God, he doesn't remember me. The realization sent a sharp pang through her chest. She didn't know why it hurt, but it did. That night had meant something to her. But to him, it had clearly been forgettable. She forced herself to remain professional, keeping her shoulders squared and her expression neutral. He can't know. Not yet. Not until she figured out what to do. Sophie spent the rest of the day drowning in paperwork, emails, and schedules, doing everything she could to avoid being alone with him. But that was impossible, when her entire job revolved around assisting him. Every time he called her into his office, every time his voice rumbled across the room, her body betrayed her. Memories of that night, his lips on her skin, the way his hands had worshipped her, flooded her mind like a tidal wave. And the worst part? Nathaniel had no idea. No idea that every time he brushed past her, every time their fingers accidentally touched, her stomach twisted in knots. No idea that his child was growing inside her. And no idea that fate had just thrown them into the most complicated mess imaginable. Sophie tried her best to ignore him, tried to ignore the way his piercing blue eyes lingered on her a second too long, tried to ignore the way his deep voice sent shivers down her spine, tried to ignore the way the air between them crackled like a live wire every time they were in the same room. But it was impossible. Working as Nathaniel Knight's assistant was proving to be a dangerous game, one where every stolen glance, every accidental touch threatened to unravel the fragile control she had over herself. And the worst part, Nathaniel was noticing her too. Miss Carter. His voice was smooth as silk, yet filled with authority as she stepped into his office. "Yes, Mr. Knight." She kept her tone professional, even though her pulse raced like a drum against her ribs. He stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, his hands in his pockets, the sunlight casting sharp shadows over his chiseled jaw and powerful frame. Sophie tried not to stare, tried not to remember the way those same strong hands had once held her so intimately. He turned slowly, his gaze locking onto hers. Something flickered in his eyes, curiosity, interest. Something more. She forced herself to breathe. "You've been avoiding me," he said smoothly, his lips curving just the slightest bit. Her stomach tightened. She swallowed, straightening her spine. "I've been busy." His gaze flicked over her face, as if searching for something hidden beneath her words. His deep hum vibrated through the air, unsettling her even more. "You don't strike me as the kind of woman who avoids things, Miss Carter." She stiffened, her fingers tightening around the folder she was holding. "I don't." His lips twitched, as if he was enjoying this. But then he took a slow step forward, too close. Close enough that she could smell his clean, intoxicating cologne. Close enough that she could see the slight scruff on his jaw, the flecks of silver in his dark hair. Close enough that she could feel her heart slamming against her ribs. His fingers brushed hers as he took the folder from her hands, the touch sending a bolt of heat straight through her. And by the way, his jaw clenched. She knew he felt it too. Damn it! The next few days were torturous. Every interaction between them was charged with something neither of them acknowledged. She could feel his eyes on her constantly, watching her when he thought she wasn't looking, his gaze burning into her with an intensity that made it hard to breathe. When she stood by his desk, handing him documents, his fingers would brush against hers, just enough to make her shiver. When she walked past him, she could feel the weight of his stare on her back, like he was trying to figure her out. And when their gazes met across the office, there was always a moment, just a moment, where the world around them disappeared. Sophie knew she had to be careful. Nathaniel was too smart, too perceptive. If she wasn't careful, he would start asking questions, and she wasn't ready for that. Because how could she tell him? How could she tell the most powerful man in the city, the man who probably had women throwing themselves at his feet, that she was carrying his child? Would he even believe her? Or would he think she was just another woman trying to trap him for his money? The thought sent a chill down her spine. She needed more time. She needed to keep the secret just a little longer. But deep down, she knew the truth. Secrets never stayed hidden forever. And with the way Nathaniel Knight was watching her, it was only a matter of time before he uncovered the truth. Sophie never expected to be in Paris with Nathaniel Knight. Yet here she was, standing on the balcony of a 5-star luxury hotel, staring at the glittering lights of the city below. The Eiffel Tower loomed in the distance, its golden glow illuminating the night. The air was crisp, filled with the scent of fresh rain and blooming roses from the gardens below. It was breathtaking, yet nothing, not the dazzling lights, not the stunning view, compared to the man standing beside her, Nathaniel, her boss, her mystery lover, the father of her child. And he had no idea. The business trip had been intense, days filled with high-profile meetings, negotiations, and formal dinners. But tonight was different. Tonight, it was just the two of them. A private rooftop dinner arranged by Nathaniel himself. Sophie sat across from him at the elegantly set table, candles flickering between them. The soft melody of a violin played in the background, and the Parisian skyline stretched endlessly before them. It felt intimate, too intimate. "Are you enjoying Paris?" Nathaniel's deep voice broke the silence, his gaze locked onto hers. She swallowed, her fingers tightening around her wineglass. "It's beautiful." His lips curved slightly. "It is. But—" He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "You seem distracted." Her breath hitched. She couldn't let her emotions slip. "Not now. Not here." "I guess I'm just tired," she said, forcing a small smile. Nathaniel's piercing blue eyes studied her, as if searching for something beneath her words, something deeper. Then, in a move that sent her pulse racing, he reached across the table and took her hand. His touch was warm, firm, comforting, and it set her entire body on fire. "You're not just tired," he murmured, his thumb brushing against her skin. "Something's on your mind." Her heart pounded so hard she was sure he could hear it. She should pull away. She should, but she couldn't, because God help her, she didn't want to. After dinner, Nathaniel insisted they take a walk. The streets of Paris were alive with romance. Lovers strolling hand in hand, soft laughter echoing in the air, the scent of fresh bread wafting from nearby cafes. Sophie hugged herself, trying to fight the storm brewing inside her. But then Nathaniel did something unexpected. He stopped, right beneath the Eiffel Tower. Its golden lights bathed them in a warm glow, the world around them fading into nothingness. And then he turned to her. "I need to tell you something." Her breath caught. His expression was serious, intense, raw. "I don't usually let people in," he admitted, his voice lower now, rougher. "But you're different, Sophie." Her chest tightened. "I can't stop thinking about you," he went on, his hand reaching for hers again. "Since the day you walked into my office, you've been in my head, distracting me in ways I don't understand." She swallowed hard. This wasn't happening. It couldn't be happening. Nathaniel Knight, the cold, powerful billionaire, was standing beneath the Eiffel Tower, confessing his feelings to her. And he had no idea that the connection between them ran deeper than he knew. His fingers brushed her cheek, sending a shiver down her spine. "Tell me you feel it too," he murmured, "because, Sophie, I can't pretend anymore." She should lie. She should walk away. She should do anything but what she did next. Because the moment his lips hovered over hers, her resolve shattered. And then, just like that night so many months ago, she was lost in him. Nathaniel's lips claimed hers with desperate hunger, his arms wrapping around her, pulling her close, until there was no space left between them. The world melted away. His kiss was demanding, intoxicating, everything she had tried to forget, yet everything she still craved. And as her hands slid into his hair, as his fingers dug into her waist, as their bodies pressed together beneath the shimmering Parisian sky, Sophie realized something terrifying. She wasn't just keeping a secret from him, she was falling for him. And there was no turning back now. Paris had felt like a dream, a beautiful, intoxicating dream. But dreams always ended, and Sophie's ended in the worst way possible. Back at the Knight Enterprises headquarters, things had been different. Nathaniel had been softer with her, more attentive. He found excuses to be near her, brushing his fingers against hers when handing over documents, his lingering gazes growing more intense. Sophie had allowed herself to hope. Maybe, just maybe, what had happened in Paris meant something. Maybe she wasn't just his assistant. Maybe the way he kissed her, the way he held her like she was something precious, meant he felt it too, but hope was a dangerous thing. And it all came crashing down in an instant. Sophie had just finished preparing Nathaniel's schedule for the day when she heard muffled voices coming from his office. She had no intention of eavesdropping, but the second she heard her name, her steps faltered. She shouldn't listen, she should walk away, but something stopped her. And then she heard the words that ripped her world apart. "You need to stop playing games, Nathaniel. You're engaged to Victoria. It's time you took your responsibilities seriously." Sophie's blood ran cold. Victoria. Engaged. Number. It had to be a mistake, a misunderstanding. Nathaniel's voice followed, but it wasn't the denial she desperately hoped for. "I know. The merger is important. The deal will go through." Merger. deal. Her stomach twisted violently. Oh, God, Nathaniel wasn't just engaged, it was a business arrangement, and she was the fool who had let herself believe she meant something to him. Sophie staggered back, bile rising in her throat. Her heart shattered in a way she never thought possible. How could she have been so stupid? Every glance, every touch, every passionate kiss in Paris, was it all just a game to him? Did he even care about her at all? Or had she been nothing but a temporary distraction before he went back to his perfect, powerful fiancée? She pressed a trembling hand to her stomach where his child was growing inside her. Nathaniel had kissed her beneath the Eiffel Tower, whispered confessions into her skin, all while knowing he belonged to someone else. She felt sick, and the worst part, she was in love with him. She stumbled away from the door before she could hear anything else. She needed to get out. Now. The walls of the office felt like they were closing in, suffocating her, drowning her in betrayal. Sophie rushed into the elevator, her hands shaking as she pressed the button for the ground floor. Tears blurred her vision, but she refused to let them fall. Not here, not now. As the doors slid shut, she whispered the painful truth to herself. He doesn't love you. He never did, and he never would. Sophie had made up her mind. She had to leave. There was no other way. The betrayal she felt in Nathaniel's office had been like a knife to her heart. The man she had begun to fall for, the man who had kissed her beneath the Eiffel Tower, whispered words that made her believe in love again, was engaged to another woman, and she was carrying his child. A child he didn't even know existed. She wouldn't let herself be his second choice, his secret, his mistake. So she wrote her resignation letter, placed it on his desk, and prepared to walk away. But fate had other plans. Sophie barely made it to the elevator before the room tilted violently. Her vision blurred. Her limbs went weak. A sharp pain shot through her stomach, and before she could reach for the wall to steady herself, her knees buckled. The last thing she heard before everything went black was a deep, familiar voice shouting her name. Then, darkness. The rhythmic beeping of a heart monitor was the first thing Sophie registered when she regained consciousness. The second was the strong, warm hand wrapped around hers. She blinked, her throat dry, as she turned her head. Nathaniel sat beside her hospital bed, his piercing blue eyes filled with something she couldn't decipher, something raw and intense. But before she could speak, the doctor entered the room, flipping through her chart with a kind smile. "You're going to be fine, Miss Carter. You just need to take it easy. Stress isn't good for the baby." Silence. A silence so thick, so overwhelming, Sophie felt it crackle like a storm in the air. Her breath caught. Slowly, so slowly, she turned her head. Nathaniel was completely still. His jaw was tight, his grip on her hand suddenly firm. His entire body was rigid, like a man who had just been told his entire world had shifted beneath his feet. His voice was low, controlled, but dangerously strained when he finally spoke. "Baby?" Sophie's heart pounded. This was it. There was no more hiding, no more running. She swallowed, her lips trembling as she whispered the words she had been terrified to say. "I'm pregnant, Nathaniel." For the longest moment, he didn't move, didn't blink, didn't breathe. And then, his grip on her hand tightened. "Why didn't you tell me?" His voice was a mix of anger, shock, and something deeper, something she couldn't quite name. Her throat burned. "Because I didn't want to be your responsibility, because I—" Her voice cracked. "Because I didn't think you would care." Nathaniel flinched. A flicker of something, pain, flashed in his eyes. He stood abruptly, running a hand through his hair, pacing the room like a caged lion. Sophie watched as he struggled to process it. She expected rage. She expected him to accuse her of hiding the truth, of trying to trap him. But when he finally stopped pacing and turned to her, his expression wasn't just anger. It was something far more dangerous. Something that made her chest tighten with emotions she wasn't ready to face. His next words sent a shiver down her spine. "This changes everything, Sophie." Nathaniel had never been the kind of man who hesitated. In the world of business, he was ruthless, a man who made decisions swiftly, unapologetically, without second-guessing himself. But this was different. He stood in his penthouse office, staring at the city skyline, his mind a battlefield of emotions. The moment he had found out about Sophie's pregnancy, everything had changed. Nothing else mattered, not his wealth, not his carefully structured life, not even the billion-dollar merger his family had spent years orchestrating. He wanted her, his child. But Victoria Hastings wasn't a woman who accepted rejection gracefully, and she was about to prove just how dangerous she could be. Nathaniel wasted no time. That same evening, he met Victoria in an exclusive, members-only lounge, one they had both frequented over the years. She was already waiting for him, her perfect red lips curled into a knowing smirk. "You're late," she said, swirling the wine in her glass. Nathaniel didn't sit, he didn't waste words. "I'm calling off the engagement." The smirk didn't waver. Not at first. Then her fingers tightened around the stem of her glass. "I'm sorry," she said with a laugh that didn't reach her cold, calculating eyes. "I must have misheard you." "I'm not marrying you, Victoria," Nathaniel said, his voice firm, unshaken. "The merger, the deal, it's over." The silence that followed was deafening. Victoria's gaze darkened, her perfectly manicured nails digging into her palm, and then she smiled. A slow, venomous smile that sent a warning chill down Nathaniel's spine. "Oh, Nathaniel," she murmured, tilting her head. "You think you can just walk away?" She leaned forward, her voice dropping to a whisper. "You forget who I am." And that was when he knew. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. 2 days later, Sophie received a package. At first, she thought it was from Nathaniel, but when she opened the envelope and saw the printed photographs inside, her blood turned to ice. Pictures of her. From months ago. Leaving a rundown apartment, looking tired, disheveled. One image even caught her in a moment of vulnerability, sitting on a park bench, clutching her stomach, a look of worry in her eyes. A small note was attached. "Gold digger? Or something worse? Let's see what the media thinks." Sophie's hands shook. It didn't take a genius to figure out who had sent them. Victoria. The message was clear. If Sophie didn't back off, Victoria would destroy her. That evening, Nathaniel found her in her apartment, sitting on the couch, the envelope clutched in her hands. She didn't look up when he walked in, but he could see it. The fear, the heartbreak, the walls she was putting up between them. "What's wrong?" he demanded. She laughed, a hollow, empty sound, as she tossed the photographs onto the coffee table. Nathaniel's jaw tightened as he picked them up. His fingers curled into fists. Victoria had gone too far. "I can handle this," he said, his voice dangerous. Sophie's eyes met his, glassy with unshed tears. "Can you?" she whispered. "Because I can't." His heart clenched. "You don't have to fight this alone." She let out a shuddering breath. "Nathaniel, I don't belong in your world." He took a step closer, then another, until he was kneeling in front of her, his hands gently cupping her face. "You belong with me." A tear slipped down her cheek. He wiped it away, his thumb lingering on her skin. "Nathaniel." Her voice broke. "Victoria, she'll ruin you. Your business, your reputation, everything you've built." He didn't hesitate. "I don't care." But Sophie did. Because loving him meant more than just passion, more than just the fire that burned between them. It meant wanting what was best for him. And she wasn't sure she was. Nathaniel had spent years building his empire, a fortune that made him one of the most powerful men in the world. But in that moment, as he looked into Sophie's tear-filled eyes, he knew. None of it mattered. Not if he didn't have her. Not if he lost the woman who had turned his world upside down, the woman carrying his child. So he made his decision. He walked into the Knight Enterprises boardroom the next morning and announced it. He was stepping down. He was giving up his empire, his position, his fortune. Gasps filled the room. His father stood, rage flashing across his face. "Do you even know what you're doing?" Nathaniel didn't blink. Yes. Victoria was there too, standing in the shadows, her expression unreadable. She had expected him to choose his wealth. She was wrong. Later that night, he showed up at Sophie's apartment. When she opened the door and saw him standing there, his blue eyes filled with something unshakable, she knew. She knew. "What did you do?" she whispered. Nathaniel stepped forward, his hands sliding around her waist, pulling her flush against him. "I chose you." Then his lips crashed into hers, and Sophie broke. Tears streamed down her face as she kissed him back, pouring every emotion into him, her love, her fear, her relief. And as Nathaniel lifted her into his arms, carrying her inside, she knew. This wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. Sophie had spent her life believing that love always came with conditions. Her father had walked out on her and her mother when she was just 5, chasing a life of luxury and leaving them behind in a tiny apartment filled with broken dreams. Her last boyfriend had cheated, proving that no matter how much she gave, it was never enough. And now, standing in the doorway of her apartment, staring at Nathaniel, she realized something terrifying. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to throw herself into his arms, to let his promises wrap around her like armor, to believe that he had truly chosen her. But she was afraid. Because if she let herself believe in him and he let her down, it would destroy her. She took a shaky breath, stepping back, her fingers tightening on the doorframe as she whispered, "You gave up everything." Nathaniel nodded, his blue eyes burning with conviction. Everything. She swallowed hard. The Nathaniel Knight she had met that night, the one who had taken her in his arms, kissed her like she was the only woman in the world, wasn't a man who gave up power easily. And yet he had walked away. From his empire, from his billions, for her, for their child. It should have been enough. So why did it still feel like her heart was wrapped in chains? Sophie's voice was small when she finally spoke. "Why?" Nathaniel exhaled sharply, his expression torn between frustration and something raw, vulnerable. "Because I love you," he said, his voice hoarse. "Because the thought of a life without you, without our child, is unbearable." Her chest tightened. Love. She had dreamed of hearing those words from him, achingly hoped for them, but dreams weren't reality, and reality had already taught her not to trust so easily. She let out a bitter laugh, shaking her head. "Love isn't always enough, Nathaniel." He flinched, but he didn't back down. "Maybe not," he admitted, "but I will spend every damn day proving that I'm not going anywhere, that this isn't just some impulsive decision. I didn't choose you over my company. I chose you because you are my future." Her breath hitched. But before she could say anything, he took a slow step forward, then another, until he was so close. She could feel the warmth of his breath against her skin. "You don't have to believe me right now," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Just Don't shut me out." Her eyes stung with unshed tears because she wanted to. God, she wanted to. But there was still a voice inside her head whispering, "What if he regrets it? What if he realizes you're not enough? What if he wakes up one day and wishes he had chosen power instead?" She couldn't survive another heartbreak. But Nathaniel had never been a man who walked away from a challenge, and he wasn't about to start now. The days passed, and Nathaniel didn't leave. He didn't push. He didn't demand. He was simply there. Every morning, he showed up at her apartment with breakfast, a quiet smile on his face. Every afternoon, he found small ways to take care of her. Whether it was fixing the leak in her sink or rubbing gentle circles on her lower back when her pregnancy pains started, every night he kissed her forehead before saying, "Good night, Sophie. I'll be here tomorrow." And slowly, ever so slowly, the ice around her heart began to thaw. One evening, as they sat on her tiny couch watching a movie, she found herself leaning into him. She felt his breath hitch, his arms slowly wrapped around her, tentative, waiting, like he was afraid she would pull away. She didn't. Instead, she turned her face toward his, their noses almost brushing. Nathaniel swallowed hard, his voice barely above a whisper. "Tell me to stop." She didn't. Instead, she did something she hadn't done in weeks. She kissed him. It started soft, almost hesitant, but then his hands slid into her hair and suddenly it wasn't hesitant anymore. It was desperate, deep, consuming. His tongue traced the seam of her lips, and she let him in, moaning softly as he pulled her against him, his body heat melting every last bit of doubt inside her. When they finally broke apart, he rested his forehead against hers, his breath uneven. "I love you, Sophie." And this time, she didn't fight it. This time, she let herself believe. Nathaniel had spent years building his empire once. Now he was building something even more important. A life with Sophie, a future for their child. And this time, he was doing it from the ground up. The world had expected him to fail. When Nathaniel walked away from Knight Enterprises, the media had feasted on the scandal. Headlines screamed about the billionaire who lost it all for love. Investors distanced themselves. Former business partners whispered that, without his family's backing, he was nothing. But Nathaniel knew better. He hadn't lost everything. He had gained something priceless. And he was about to prove that he didn't need a billion-dollar corporation to be powerful. He just needed his determination. And Sophie. Sophie watched him from across the cafe, her hands wrapped around a warm cup of tea, her belly growing with their child. Nathaniel was at a corner table, laptop open, deep in conversation with a potential investor. He was relentless, focused, unstoppable. And he was doing it all for her, for them. It terrified her, because what if it all fell apart again? What if years from now he regretted everything? What if he woke up one morning and wished he had chosen power instead of love? She shook her head, pushing the thoughts away. He had proven himself, again and again. Yet the scars of her past, the betrayal, the abandonment, were not so easily erased. She wanted to believe in him. But trusting someone completely, that was still the hardest thing she had ever faced. Nathaniel worked tirelessly. Days blurred into nights. He refused to let his pride get in the way, taking small consulting gigs, helping struggling companies rebuild, using the same brilliant mind that had made him a billionaire before. He hustled. He made connections, and slowly, piece by piece, his new company, Knight Innovations, began to take shape. It wasn't a billion-dollar empire, not yet, but it was his. And he was doing it without his family's influence, without their money. Just his talent, his determination, his love for Sophie. And she saw it. Every time he came home, exhausted but smiling, because he knew he was fighting for something real. Every time he touched her belly, whispering promises to their unborn child. Every time he looked at her like she was his entire world. She saw it, and her walls began to crumble. It was raining that night. Soft droplets tapped against the window as Nathaniel slid into bed beside her. She was already under the covers, her hands resting gently on her growing stomach. He didn't say a word, just watched her. His fingers traced lazy patterns on her arm, his touch feather-light. "You should sleep," she murmured. "I will," he whispered. "I just like looking at you." Her heart stuttered. No one had ever looked at her the way he did, like she was precious, like she was his home. She turned to face him, her fingers tentatively brushing through his dark hair, still damp from the rain. "I don't deserve this," she whispered. "I don't deserve you." His blue eyes darkened. "Don't say that." His voice was rough with emotion. She let out a shaky breath. "I've spent so long being afraid of love, of trust, of being left behind. I don't know how to stop being scared." Nathaniel cupped her face. "You don't have to stop," he said softly. "I'll wait. I'll wait as long as it takes." Tears burned her eyes, because he meant it. And for the first time in her life, she felt safe. She reached for him then, pulling him into a deep, desperate kiss. He groaned against her lips, his hands sliding to her waist, careful but possessive. His body pressed against hers, warmth spreading between them, his heartbeat thundering in sync with hers. When they finally pulled apart, his forehead rested against hers. Breathless. "I love you, Sophie," he murmured. "I will never stop proving it." And this time, she didn't hesitate. This time, she whispered back, "I believe you." The city glowed under the warm hues of twilight, the skyline painted in shades of orange, pink, and gold. Sophie stood on the rooftop of their favorite cafe, her breath hitching as she took in the sight before her. Twinkling fairy lights draped above, casting a golden glow around the rooftop. A soft melody played in the background, the kind of song that wrapped around your soul and made you believe in love again. The air smelled of roses, hundreds of them, scattered along the floor in delicate petals. And in the middle of it all, waiting for her, was Nathaniel. Her heart pounded as she met his gaze. Those piercing blue eyes filled with something deep, something raw, something endless. Sophie had never dreamed of grand proposals. She had never imagined herself in a fairy tale moment, standing under the stars, being asked to spend forever with someone. Because forever had always seemed like a lie. But standing here, with Nathaniel looking at her like she was the only thing that mattered in the world, she realized something. This wasn't a dream. This was real. This was love. Nathaniel took a deep breath, then slowly got down on one knee. Sophie gasped, her hand flying to her mouth, her heart pounding so hard it threatened to burst. He reached into his pocket, pulling out a small velvet box. But when he opened it, there was no diamond, no extravagant, expensive ring. Instead, there was a simple, delicate silver band, adorned with a tiny sapphire. It was beautiful in its simplicity, and it made tears burn in her eyes. Nathaniel looked up at her, his voice filled with love, with certainty, with something unshakable. "Sophie, it was never about the money." Her breath caught. "It was never about wealth or power or the life I left behind. It was always about you." Her vision blurred as tears slipped down her cheeks. Nathaniel took her hand in his thumb brushing over her fingers with infinite tenderness. "From the moment I met you, I knew my life would never be the same. You changed me, Sophie. You made me realize that love isn't about what we have. It's about who we have." Her chest tightened. His voice softened, filled with so much emotion it nearly broke her. "I love you, not because of fate, not because of circumstance, but because you are the best thing that has ever happened to me, and I want to spend the rest of my life proving that to you." His hands trembled slightly as he held the ring up to her. "Will you marry me?" Sophie couldn't breathe, couldn't think. Tears spilled freely from her eyes as she stared down at the man who had given up everything for her, the man who had fought for her when she'd been too afraid to fight for herself, the man who had chosen her. Again and again. Her lips parted, but no words came out, so instead she dropped to her knees, right in front of him. Nathaniel's eyes widened in shock, but before he could speak, Sophie grabbed his face and kissed him. Hard, desperate, fierce. He groaned into her mouth, his hands wrapping around her waist, pulling her against him like he never wanted to let go. And he didn't. Not then. Not ever. When they finally broke apart, their foreheads pressed together, Sophie let out a shaky breath, her heart full, her soul complete. Then, with the widest smile, she whispered the only word that mattered. "Yes." Nathaniel let out a breathless laugh, his eyes shining with pure, unfiltered joy. He slid the ring onto her finger, then cupped her face and kissed her again. Slow, deep, full of love. Around them, the fairy lights flickered. The city lights shimmered, and somewhere in the distance, a gentle breeze carried the whispered promise of a future built not on power, not on wealth, but on love. The day Sophie gave birth to their baby girl was the most beautiful, overwhelming, and perfect day of their lives. Nathaniel was by her side every moment, his hand gripping hers through each contraction, his eyes never leaving her face, his voice a constant reassurance. Sophie had always wondered what kind of father Nathaniel would be, especially after all the sacrifices he had made for her and their future. But when she saw him hold their baby for the first time, cradling her tiny body against his chest with the gentlest touch, every fear she had about him disappeared. He wasn't just a billionaire businessman, he was her partner, he was a father, and he was everything she had hoped he could be. In the weeks that followed, Sophie and Nathaniel settled into a life that in many ways felt like a dream. Their home, nestled in the quiet part of the city, was filled with laughter, love, and the sweet cooing of their daughter. Her tiny hands reaching for them, her big, curious eyes mirroring the deep love they felt for her. Nathaniel worked tirelessly, not in the corner office of some grand skyscraper, but at home, alongside Sophie, as they created a life together. He balanced the demands of his new business while also taking the time to change diapers, soothe their daughter to sleep, and hold Sophie close after long days. Every night after their baby girl had drifted off to sleep, Nathaniel would wrap his arms around Sophie, pressing soft kisses to her forehead. They would talk about everything and nothing, often just lying there in silence, with the weight of the world outside, feeling so distant, so insignificant in comparison to the love that surrounded them. Nathaniel's love for their daughter was something Sophie had never expected. She had always believed that a man like Nathaniel, who had grown up in a world of power and influence, would be distant, detached from the more everyday aspects of life. But every time he looked at their daughter, his face softened, his eyes melting with pure devotion. He would spend hours reading to her, letting her tiny fingers wrap around his strong hands as he sang lullabies softly in the quiet of the nursery. Sophie would watch them, her heart swelling with pride, her love for him growing deeper and deeper. One evening after dinner, Nathaniel gently picked their daughter up from her crib, her little legs kicking in the air. He brought her over to Sophie, pressing a gentle kiss to her forehead. "She looks just like you," he whispered. Sophie smiled, brushing a hand through his hair. "Number. She's all you, Nathaniel. She has your eyes, your smile, your spirit." Their daughter cooed, her eyes bright, her tiny hand reaching out to Sophie. Sophie smiled through her tears. "She's perfect." Nathaniel pulled her closer, placing his hand on the small of her back. "Number we are," he said softly. "We are perfect. Together." As months passed, Sophie and Nathaniel proved to each other and to themselves that love wasn't about wealth, power, or status. It was about choosing each other every single day. In small moments and grand gestures, through the highs and the lows. Nathaniel's company grew slowly but steadily, but it was never the focus of their lives. Sophie, too, found her own passion, starting a small design business from home, creating beautiful pieces that became increasingly popular among local customers. They supported each other's dreams, even when they seemed impossible. Even when life threw them challenges they weren't prepared for, they faced them together. Side by side, hand in hand. One evening, as they stood on the balcony of their home, watching the sun set over the city, Nathaniel wrapped his arms around Sophie's waist, pulling her close. "Do you ever think about how far we've come?" he whispered. Sophie leaned back into his embrace, letting the warmth of his body envelop her. "Every day," she said softly. "And I still can't believe how lucky I am to be here with you, to have everything I ever wanted." Nathaniel kissed her gently on the neck, his lips lingering against her skin. "This is only the beginning, Sophie. We've only just started our forever." Sophie closed her eyes, savoring the moment, knowing that this was the life she had always dreamed of, not one of wealth or prestige, but one of genuine love and unwavering commitment. And for the first time, Sophie didn't fear the future. She didn't fear what might happen or what they might face, because as long as they had each other, they had everything they needed. As their daughter grew, so did their bond. Sophie and Nathaniel often found themselves looking at their family in awe, realizing that they had built a life out of nothing but love. Nathaniel never let his ambition or past mistakes overshadow their family life. Instead, he was present. He was here, showing up each day, reminding Sophie that their love wasn't a fleeting thing, it was a commitment. He would often remind her how much she meant to him. One evening, as they sat together on the couch, their daughter nestled between them, Nathaniel leaned in and kissed Sophie's cheek, his voice low and sincere. "You were always the one I was meant to find, the one I was meant to love." Sophie looked into his eyes, the same love that had brought them together shining back at her. "I love you, Nathaniel. Always have, always will." He pulled her close, holding her as if she was the most precious thing in his world. And in that moment, Sophie knew without a doubt that their love would continue to defy all odds. They had built a life together, not on the foundation of money or status, but on something far stronger. Unwavering love, deep trust, and an unbreakable bond that would last forever. And no matter what life threw their way, they would always choose each other every single day,